Bleach smells like honesty. It strips everything down to what's actually there, no matter how much cologne a man layers over it. Delia Reyes had scrubbed the long table at Renzo's for 2 years, with a rag in one hand and a bucket that cost the restaurant $9 at a supply outlet off Route 9. And in that time, she had learned exactly what 7 powerful men smelled like when they lied. Tonight, under a chandelier that cost more than her apartment, Salvatore Renzo told her to vanish. 11:42. 18 minutes until $4.2 million crossed the river blind. She did not vanish. She turned around instead and named every man at that table who had ever lied to him, one by one, starting with his own driver. She did not raise her voice to do it. She never got the chance to explain how she knew. Not that night, anyway. Morning arrived the way it always did on Delia's block, with the smell of somebody's burnt toast drifting through a window screen that had been patched with duct tape since March. She woke at 5:10 without an alarm because her body no longer trusted alarms. 26 years old, and her knees already cracked like a woman twice her age, the cartilage worn thin from 10 years of concrete floors. She lay still for 4 seconds, long enough to remember the number. $380. That was the gap. Rent was $1,140, due Friday, non-negotiable, and she had $860 folded into a coffee can behind the cereal because she didn't trust banks with overdraft fees that ate rent money for breakfast. $380 stood between her and a conversation with Mr. Petrosky that she had rehearsed in the shower more times than she could count. A conversation that always ended the same way, with him saying the word eviction like it tasted good in his mouth. She showered in under 4 minutes because the water heater gave her 4 minutes of warm before it turned to a threat. She dressed in the same black slacks she'd owned since a Ross Dress for Less closed out its inventory 2 winters ago. $12. The seam at the left knee, gone thin as paper. Her polo shirt, navy, Renzo's stitched in gold thread over the breast, smelled of the industrial detergent from the laundromat where she worked mornings. A smell like wet pennies and lavender trying too hard. In the next room, her sister Marisol coughed twice, a wet rattling sound, and reached for the inhaler on the nightstand before she was even fully awake. 12 years old, and already an expert in the specific choreography of an asthma attack at dawn. The inhaler had 11 puffs left in it by Delia's count, and the refill was $120 with the copay because their mother's old insurance had lapsed the month she died, and nobody had gotten around to fixing that particular piece of paperwork because grief doesn't leave much room on the desk for insurance forms. "You're staring again," Marisol said, not opening her eyes. "I'm counting your breaths. Count something that pays rent." Delia almost laughed. It wasn't funny. It was true, and true things didn't need to be funny to land. She worked the laundromat from 6 to 10, folding other people's underwear for $9 an hour, cash, off the books. The owner, a man named Duckworth, who paid late on principal and smelled permanently of the machine solvent that kept the dryers from smoking. By 10:15, she was on the number 14 bus, transfer at Girard, standing the whole way because sitting meant somebody's grocery bag in your lap and a stranger's elbow in your ribs. And by 11, she was in the alley behind Renzo's, badging in through the service door with a keycard laminated so many times it had gone cloudy at the corners. Renzo's occupied the ground floor of a converted freight building near the river, a supper club with a menu that didn't list prices because the kind of people who ate there didn't ask. The dining room smelled of dry-aged beef and candle wax and, underneath that, always, the ghost of cigar smoke that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully lifted from the velvet booths. Delia's job was 6 hours of invisible labor, polishing glassware until it threw light like ice, resetting the long table after private dinners, vacuuming a carpet the color of dried blood, and never, under any circumstances, making eye contact with the men who ate in the back room on Thursday nights. The back room had its own name among the staff, spoken quietly, the way you'd name a weather system that could kill you. The long table, 14 feet of reclaimed oak, 7 high-backed chairs on each side, though only one side was ever used, the men seated facing the door, because men like that didn't sit with their backs to anything. Every Thursday at 7, the same 7 arrived, and every Thursday, Delia cleaned around the edges of their meeting like a moth working the rim of a lit window, close enough to feel the heat, careful never to touch the flame. She'd learned their names the way she learned everything, by accident and by attention, because attention was the only thing she had that nobody could take a cut of. Nunzio Baptiste, the driver, who always smelled of motor oil and Marlboro Reds even after a shower, a man who chewed his fingernails down past the quick. Paulie Ferro, who wore a different cufflink on his left cuff than his right and thought nobody noticed. Monogrammed silver against monogrammed gold, a marriage and a mistress, each buying him a set. Whitlock, the accountant, who reeked of toner and aqua velva and never once looked at Delia in 2 years. Not even the way you look at furniture, more the way you look at the absence of furniture. Costa, Delgado, a younger one they called Two Shoes, because he'd shown up to his first sit-down in mismatched loafers and never lived it down. And Ansel Renzo, the Don's cousin, his underboss, a man who chewed spearmint gum in a slow, deliberate rhythm, one piece after another, because the gum covered the cigarettes, and the cigarettes covered something else Delia had never quite named, not until she had to. At the head of it all sat Salvatore Renzo, and you knew he'd entered a room before you saw him, because the room announced him first, cedar and orange peel, a shaving cream he'd used since before Delia was born, a smell so specific to him that Delia sometimes caught it on a stranger on the bus, and her whole body went cold for a full block before she remembered it wasn't him. He was 51 years old, silver at the temples, a voice that never rose above a conversational register even when he was promising to end somebody's life, because he had learned long ago that quiet was more frightening than loud. Loud men were compensating. Renzo never needed to compensate for anything. By noon, Delia had reset 11 place settings, polished 40 glasses, and found $9 in loose change under the booths, which she pocketed without a flicker of guilt, because $9 was $9 and the world did not hand those out for free. $371 now, still short. By midnight, 3 days later, the air outside Renzo's smelled of river water and diesel exhaust, the specific cold that comes off a working waterfront in early spring. And inside, the back room had gone quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet, when everyone in it is pretending not to be afraid. Renzo stood at the head of the long table with a phone pressed to his ear, and around him 6 men sat like they'd been poured into their chairs and left to set. Nunzio's knee bounced under the table, a small tremor visible only if you were kneeling nearby with a rag in your hand, which Delia was, gathering a dropped napkin no one had asked her to gather. Whitlock's pen had stopped moving across his ledger 4 minutes ago, and he hadn't noticed. Two Shoes had gone the color of the tablecloth. "Say it again," Renzo said into the phone. Quiet, almost gentle. "Say it again, slower." A pause. Whatever came through the line made his jaw tighten by exactly 1 degree, a movement so small that most people would have missed it. Delia did not miss it. She had spent 2 years learning the weather of that jaw, the way sailors learn a sky. He set the phone down on the oak, screen up, and looked at the 6 men in front of him for 11 full seconds without saying anything at all. Silence has a texture. This one felt like a held breath in a room with no windows. "The Kovacs knew our river route before our own drivers did," he said finally. 3 trucks in 4 months. 2 of my men in the hospital. Tonight we're moving $4.2 million of merchandise across that water at 2 a.m. And somebody in this room has been feeding Yuri Kovac our schedule since October. Nobody moved. Nunzio's knee stopped bouncing entirely, which was somehow worse than the bouncing. "I have 18 minutes to decide whether to reroute a shipment I've been planning for 6 weeks, Renzo said, "because I don't know which one of you to trust. And I built this table on trust. Every man at it. My own blood is at this table." His eyes moved, briefly, to Ansel, and moved away again just as fast. A flicker so quick Delia would have missed it if she hadn't been watching his hands instead of his face, the way you watch a poker player's hands, because the face lies and the hands forget to. "Boss," Whitlock started. "I didn't ask you to talk, Marty." Whitlock's pen resumed its silence. Renzo looked down the length of the table, at cedar-warm candlelight throwing shadows across 7 faces that had all, at one time or another, sworn loyalty to him with their right hand on a cross that had belonged to his own father. 18 minutes, he said again, and this time the repetition was the whole threat, no volume required. Somebody in this room is going to give me a name before that clock runs out, or I reroute blind and we lose $4 million tonight, instead of finding out who's been stealing from me for 6 months. He turned toward the service door. Girl, he said, not even looking at Delia. The way you'd address a lamp you wanted turned off. Vanish. Delia stood with the dropped napkin still in her hand, 3 feet from the head of the table, close enough that she could smell the cedar and the orange peel, and, underneath it, for the first time in 2 years, something that wasn't calm, something that was, for the first time she'd ever witnessed, close to fear. She had been ready to disappear 1,000 times. She was good at it. Invisibility was a skill she'd built the same way she'd built the calluses on her palms, out of necessity, out of 2 years of being handed a rag and a bucket, and told, without anyone ever saying the words, that her job was to exist only in the negative space between important people. She did not vanish. You're looking for one traitor, she said. Every head at the table turned. It wasn't a loud voice. It was steady, which in a room like that was louder than shouting. Renzo turned back slowly, the way a man turns when he's certain he misheard something and is giving the world one more chance to correct itself. What did you say? You're looking for one traitor, Delia said again, and this time she made herself hold his eyes, which took more out of her than 2 years of double shifts had ever asked for. You don't have one. You have 7. Silence again. But it had changed shape. It had gone from a held breath to something closer to the vacuum right before a car crash. The half-second where every driver knows exactly what's about to happen and there's nothing left to do about it. Nunzio, she said, and the driver's face went the color of old paper, has been running your car to a body shop on Delancey twice a month. That isn't on any receipt you've ever signed off on, boss, because he's been skimming maintenance money and selling the difference to a chop shop for 11 months. That's not loyalty to Kovac. That's just theft. But it means every time you think your driver's clean, he's not. Not all the way. Poorly. She didn't look at him, kept her eyes on Renzo, because looking at each man as she named him would have felt like begging, and she was done begging for anything tonight. Wears 2 different sets of cufflinks because he's got a second family in Bayonne he thinks nobody knows about, and the woman he's keeping there works the front desk at a shipping office that happens to book cargo manifests for 3 companies you use. He didn't mean to give her anything. He talks in his sleep, boss, or he talks after 3 drinks, which is worse, because he thinks he's charming. Whitlock cooks 2 sets of books, and one of them isn't for the IRS. Whitlock's pen finally moved, one small jerk, like a man caught breathing wrong. Costa placed 4 bets last month with a bookie who works for the Kovacs directly, and lost, and he's 4 weeks behind on payments he can't make on what you pay him, which means somebody's going to come collecting soon, and it won't be cash they ask for. Delgado's wife filed for divorce in January, and he's been telling anybody who'll listen how unfair his cut is, at bars, to strangers, because misery wants company, and he wasn't careful about who was listening. 2 Shoes photographs the delivery logs on his phone every Thursday before he leaves this room. I've seen him do it 11 times. I never told anyone because it wasn't my business until tonight. She stopped. The room had gone so still that Delia could hear the specific hum of the walk-in refrigerator 2 rooms away, a sound she'd never once noticed in 2 years of cleaning this building, because there had never before been a silence deep enough to hold it. That's 6, Renzo said. His voice hadn't changed volume. It had changed everything else. Yeah, Delia said. The 7th one's the reason the other 6 don't matter tonight. She looked at Ansel Renzo for the first time since she'd started talking. He had stopped chewing his gum. His hand, resting flat on the oak table, had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man performing the act of not moving, which is its own kind of motion if you know how to see it. Your cousin switched from Marlboros to spearmint gum around the same time the Kovacs shipment intel got good, Delia said. He meets a man twice a week behind the laundromat where I work mornings, 7:45 sharp, always the same bench, and the man he meets drives a car registered to a shell company that shares an address with a warehouse the Kovacs use on the Jersey side. I fold laundry across the street. I've watched them for 2 months because it was the only interesting thing that happened in my mornings, and I didn't know what I was looking at until you said the word Kovac 4 minutes ago. Renzo did not look at his cousin. He looked at Delia, And for the first time in 2 years of scrubbing his floors, Salvatore Renzo, a man other men went silent to avoid provoking, a man whose name alone had emptied rooms, said nothing at all. The silence stretched. Somewhere down the hall, a busboy dropped a tray of ice, and nobody at the long table so much as flinched, because whatever storm had been building in that room had swallowed every smaller sound whole. "Vanish," Delia said quietly, into that silence, mostly to herself, tasting the strange shape of the word he'd used on her 4 minutes earlier. "You said vanish. I've been vanishing in this building for 2 years, boss. I got good at it. I just decided, tonight, not to." Nobody at that table moved for 11 seconds. Delia counted them the way she counted everything, because counting was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking, and she was damned if she'd let this room see her hands shake. Renzo broke the silence first, and when he did, his voice was even quieter than before, which anyone at that table could have told you was the most dangerous register he owned. "Everybody out," he said, "except the girl. And him." He didn't need to say which him. Ansel's chair scraped back 4 inches and stopped, as if his own body had reconsidered standing. The other 5 men left without a word, filing out past Delia, so close she could catalogue every one of their scents on the way by. Motor oil, aqua velva, cheap drugstore cologne worn like armor, and none of them looked at her, though for entirely different reasons than they hadn't looked at her before. When the door shut, it was just the 3 of them, and 14 feet of oak, and a phone still lying screen up on the table, its 18-minute countdown down to 9. "Explain," Renzo said. Not to Ansel, to Delia. She told him. Dates, times, the bench, the car, the gum. She left nothing out, because leaving things out was a habit for people who had something to protect, and right now the only thing Delia had left to protect was Marisol's inhaler and $869 in a coffee can, and neither of those things needed her to be careful with the truth. When she finished, Renzo turned to his cousin, and for the first time that night, his voice rose. "Not much. A single degree. 9 months," he said. 9 months I fed you off my own plate, and you sold my river to a Kovac. For what, Ansel? What was the number?" Ansel didn't answer. His jaw worked once, twice, chewing on nothing, the ghost motion of a man who'd finished his last piece of gum an hour ago, and hadn't noticed until just now that his hands had nothing left to do. Renzo picked up the phone. 9 minutes left on the counter. "Reroute the shipment," he said into it. Calm again, the fury folded back down into something smaller and colder. "South route. Now. And somebody bring me Costa's marker from that bookie. I want to know exactly how much my own accountant sold me for." He set the phone down and looked at Delia for a long moment. The kind of look she imagined a man might give a door he'd walked past 10,000 times and never once noticed was actually a window. "What's your name?" he said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, almost embarrassed, a man realizing 2 years too late that he'd never once asked. "Delia," she said. "Delia Reyes. You clean my restaurant. I clean your restaurant." He nodded slowly, the way you nod at a fact that's just rearranged the furniture of everything you thought you knew. "Not anymore," he said. She should have felt relief. She felt something closer to falling. He named a number, 6 figures, a year, cash, to work for him directly. Doing what, he didn't yet say. Only that a woman who could sit in a room for 2 years, memorizing 7 men's sins without anyone noticing her doing it, was worth more to him than an entire security detail. Delia looked at the countdown on the phone. 6 minutes. "No," she said. Silence again, briefer this time, but sharper, the specific quiet of a man unaccustomed to that word. "No," she said again, because repetition, apparently, was a language everyone at that table understood. "I've got a sister with asthma, and a landlord named Petrosky, who doesn't care whose payroll I'm on. He cares whether the check clears, and I am not putting my name on anything connected to you, because paper trails get people killed, and I've read enough newspapers to know how this ends for the help. I want cash for what happened tonight. I want it to end tonight. I have a bus to catch." It wasn't bravery, it was arithmetic, the same cold arithmetic he'd used on his own men 4 minutes earlier, and something in his face shifted when he recognized it, the way you recognize your own handwriting on a stranger's note. 5,000, he said. "Tonight, cash, for your trouble." 5,000, and I never worked here, she said. "Not on any form. Not in any conversation. Not ever. Done. She turned to leave. At the door, she stopped, because there was one more piece of arithmetic that needed saying, and she'd learned tonight that saying things out loud was cheaper than swallowing them. "You called me girl for 2 years," she said, not turning around. "You didn't know my name until the last 6 minutes of it." She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out, past Ansel Renzo, who hadn't moved from his chair, who smelled, for the first time since she'd known him, like nothing at all. No gum, no cigarettes, just the flat metallic scent of a man who understood exactly how the rest of his night was going to go. Rain had started by the time she reached the bus stop, a thin, cold rain that smelled of asphalt and river mud, and Delia stood under the plastic shelter, counting $5,000 in an envelope that had been pressed into her hand by a man in a suit she'd never seen before, and she felt nothing that resembled triumph. She felt the specific hollowness of a person who has just watched a door close behind her that she'd spent 2 years being grateful didn't exist. $371 had been the gap. Now there was no gap at all. There was, instead, an envelope that smelled faintly of cedar and orange peel, because it had sat for 4 minutes on the same table Renzo used, and Delia realized, riding the 14 bus home in the rain with her forehead against the cold glass, that she would carry that smell with her now, whether she wanted to or not. She told herself it was over. It was not over. 2 days later, on a morning that smelled of wet cardboard and the particular ozone tang that comes before a spring storm, Delia was folding a stranger's bath towels at Duckworth's laundromat when a black car pulled up outside, and a man she recognized from Thursday nights, not one of the 7, a new face, younger, careful, walked in and set an envelope on the folding table between a stack of someone's mismatched socks and a bottle of off-brand fabric softener. "Mr. Renzo would like a word," the man said. "Tell Mr. Renzo I already said no. He said you'd say that." The man didn't smile, exactly, but something in his face suggested he'd been told to expect it and found it, privately, a little bit funny. "He also said to tell you. Costa's bookie wants to know if you're interested in a job that pays better than laundry." Delia looked down at Marisol's empty inhaler, which she'd left sitting on the counter that morning as a reminder, a small, cruel ritual of guilt she inflicted on herself daily until she could afford the refill. 11 puffs had become 4. 4 had become none 3 days ago, and Marisol had spent one very long night breathing through a wet towel over her face because the emergency room copay alone was $200 they didn't have. $5,000 had covered rent and the inhaler and 6 months of breathing room, and Delia had told herself that was the whole story. A clean transaction, over and done. But 6 months went fast when you did the math honestly, and the math had never once, in Delia's whole life, done her any favors. "What's the job?" she said, and hated herself a little for asking. The way you hate yourself for reaching toward a fire because your hands are cold, even knowing exactly what fire does to hands. By midnight, the following Thursday, the long table smelled different than Delia remembered. Cleaner. 6 chairs instead of 7. One seat conspicuously empty at Ansel's old place. The wood there polished so hard it looked newer than the rest of the table, as if someone had tried to scrub away more than dust. Nobody had told Delia what happened to Ansel. Nobody needed to. The absence did the telling. "You're not cleaning tonight," Renzo said, when she walked in wearing a coat that wasn't hers, borrowed for the occasion. Because her own coat had a hole in the pocket she hadn't gotten around to mending. "You're sitting. I don't sit at your table." "You do tonight." She sat. It felt like sitting on a live wire, the seat still faintly warm from decades of other people's power, and she kept her hands flat on the oak the way Ansel's had been flat, and made herself not think about that. "Costa's gone too," Renzo said, without being asked, watching her face for a reaction she was careful not to give him. "Paulie's on notice. Whitlock's books are being audited by somebody who isn't me, which is its own kind of mercy, believe it or not. Nunzio's paying back every dollar with interest, out of his check, 20% a month until it's clear. And the shipment, south route, clean. Kovac's still looking for the leak he lost, doesn't know yet it's gone." A faint, humorless motion at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "You cost him a great deal of confusion, Ms. Reyes." "You're welcome." That got something closer to a real reaction. a short exhale through his nose that might, in a different man, have been a laugh. "I have a proposal," he said. "Not employment, a retainer. You come to this table once a month. You watch. You listen. You tell me what you see. The way you saw 6 months of my own blood, robbing me blind while I served him dinner. Cash. No paper. No name on anything. The way you wanted it. And if I say no again, then you say no again, and I drive you home myself, and we never speak of it." He said this evenly, without any of the weight she'd expected, and something about the flatness of the offer, no threat folded into it, no leverage dressed up as generosity, made her trust it a fraction more than she wanted to. She thought about Marisol's lungs. She thought about Mr. Petrosky's face when the rent cleared 4 days early for the first time in 2 years. She thought about the specific, humiliating math of being poor, the way it made every good decision look like weakness, and every bad one look like the only sane choice on the table. "Once a month," she said, "I watch. I don't touch anything, I don't carry anything, and the day I see something I can't live with, I walk. And you let me walk." Agreed. It felt, she thought later, riding home in a car that smelled of cedar and leather instead of a rattling bus, exactly like what it was. A beautiful trap, dressed up as a rescue, and she had walked into it with her eyes open, because the alternative was watching her sister breathe through a towel one more time, and there was no version of pride that survived contact with that sound. The second test came 6 weeks later, on a night that smelled of low tide and hot asphalt, at a warehouse on the Jersey side where 400 crates were due to change hands at 3 a.m. between Renzo's people and a buyer nobody in the room fully trusted. Delia stood near the loading doors in a coat that was, this time, actually hers, watching 40 men move crates under sodium lights that turned everyone's skin the color of an old bruise. She wasn't there to lift anything. She was there, as she had been every month since the long table, to watch. And what she watched, 20 minutes into the exchange, was a man on the buyer's side, young, nervous, sweating through a jacket too heavy for the weather, check his phone 4 times in 6 minutes, each time angling the screen away from his own boss, with a small, unconscious rotation of his shoulder that Delia recognized because she'd spent 2 years learning exactly what a lie looked like from behind a rag and a bucket. She crossed to Renzo, who stood near the office door with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the exchange the way a man watches weather he can't control but refuses to look away from. "Your buyer's got somebody outside," she said quietly. "The kid in the wet jacket's been texting a location, not a person, 4 times since we got here. That's not a nervous new hire, that's a man setting a pin." Renzo's expression didn't change, which by now, Delia understood was its own kind of tell. He said one word into a radio clipped inside his coat, and within 90 seconds, 2 of his men had the kid in the wet jacket, walked quietly toward the office. No shouting, no scene, the whole thing executed with the flat, bored efficiency of men doing paperwork. The buyer's people noticed. A ripple went through them, hands drifting toward jackets, the particular held-breath tension of a room deciding whether tonight was the night it went bad. "Everybody finish loading," Renzo said, not loudly, and somehow that was enough. The tension didn't vanish. It just agreed, collectively, to wait. 20 minutes later, the kid in the wet jacket had told 2 of Renzo's men everything. A rival crew out of Elizabeth, not Kovac this time, a different appetite entirely, looking to seize the whole shipment mid-exchange rather than merely rob its route. And Renzo, standing in the doorway of that office, with the sodium light turning his face the color of an old photograph, gave the order for what happened to that information, with the same offhand quiet he'd given order for lunch. Move the timeline up an hour, lose the kid somewhere he can walk home from, eventually, once he's forgotten how to talk, and find out who in Elizabeth's paying him, because I want a conversation with that man before the week's out. He said it the way another man might say, "Hold the mustard," and that, Delia understood, watching him, was the whole architecture of his fear. Not the violence, the ease of it. She said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She had asked, weeks ago, for the right to walk the day she saw something she couldn't live with. And this, a scared kid getting driven somewhere in the dark by men who did this the way other men mowed lawns, sat right on the edge of that line without quite crossing it, and she hated how carefully that line had been drawn, and hated more that some cold arithmetic in her own chest had already started calculating whether she could still make herself walk away. She didn't walk. Not that night. By 4 a.m. the crates were loaded and gone. The warehouse empty, except for the smell of diesel and low tide, and something underneath both that Delia didn't let herself name. And Renzo found her by the loading door, where she stood, with her arms wrapped around herself against a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "You did well tonight," he said. "I didn't do anything. I watched a kid get taken away and didn't say a word. You told me the truth. That's the job. That's the trap," she said. And it came out sharper than she'd planned. Sharp enough that a man 40 feet away paused mid-stride before deciding whatever he'd heard wasn't his business. You dress it up as a retainer, cash, no paper, no name, and it feels clean right up until it isn't. And tonight, it wasn't. Renzo didn't argue with her. That, more than anything he could have said, unsettled her most of all. "Come inside," he said instead. "Have a drink before you go home. You've earned one, whatever you decide to call the rest of it." The office at the back of the warehouse smelled of cold coffee and gun oil, and, once he shut the door, of him, cedar, orange peel, the ghost of Barbasol under it all, a smell she'd learned to recognize from across a room, and now, standing 4 feet from him, in a space the size of a closet, found almost unbearably close. He poured 2 glasses of something amber from a bottle with no label, and didn't ask if she wanted it, just set it in her hand, the way you'd hand someone a blanket after a fire, an assumption of need rather than a question of preference. "You're not what I expected," he said, after the silence had stretched long enough that saying nothing had started to feel like its own kind of statement. "You didn't expect me at all. You expected furniture. Fair." A short, real smile this time, gone almost as soon as it arrived. "You want to know something true? I grew up 4 blocks from where you live now. My mother cleaned 3 houses a week to make rent, and I used to sit outside those houses on the stoop and wait for her, and I promised myself I'd never wait on anyone's stoop again as long as I lived. And now, you own the stoop." "I own a lot of stoops," he said, and there was no pride in it, just a flat, tired honesty that Delia hadn't expected from a man who'd ordered a scared kid disappeared into the dark 90 minutes earlier. "Doesn't make the smell of other people's kitchens go away. I still catch it sometimes. Bleach and boiled cabbage. Takes me right back." Delia looked down at her own hands, cracked at the knuckles from 2 years of industrial cleaner, and something in her chest loosened by a degree she didn't fully trust. "Bleach and pine sol," she said. "That's mine. You'll never get it out of my hands. Not all the way. I scrub Marisol's inhaler case every week, even though it doesn't need it, just so it smells like something clean, instead of something we can't afford." He reached out, slowly enough that she could have stopped him and didn't, and turned her hand over in his, thumb tracing the raised, silvery scar across her wrist, where a bleach splash had eaten through skin 2 winters ago, and no doctor's visit had ever properly closed. His hand was warm and rougher than she expected, from a man who wore silk ties, calloused in places that had nothing to do with silverware or spreadsheets. "Everybody at that table thinks I came from money," he said quietly. "Nobody ever asks. You didn't ask either. You just knew, the second you walked into that room and started naming smells instead of names." "I didn't know," Delia said. "I guessed. Same dirt leaves the same marks, that's all. Doesn't take a genius. Takes more than most people bother giving anything." He hadn't let go of her wrist. Neither had she pulled it away. The office was very small, and the coffee and gun oil smell of it had gone, somehow, warmer, and Delia's pulse had picked up in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a fear-adjacent thing she didn't have a clean name for. "This is a bad idea," she said. "Which part?" "All of it. Every part, going back to the night I opened my mouth instead of vanishing." "Probably," he agreed, and didn't let go. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the kind of stillness that isn't empty, that's actually the loudest thing in the room. 2 people standing very close together, doing nothing at all, and calling it nothing, though both of them understood exactly what it was. Then Delia pulled her hand back, gently, and picked her drink back up, because whatever this was, it wasn't going to finish itself in a warehouse office at 4 in the morning, with a scared kid somewhere out in the dark, and Marisol's alarm going off in 3 hours, whether Delia had slept or not. "I have laundry to fold at 6, she said. Renzo looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. And then, for the second time in 6 weeks, Salvatore Renzo laughed, short and low, and entirely real. "Of course you do," he said. She caught the last bus home, as the sky went the color of a healing bruise, grey shading into something almost gold at the edges, and she sat with her forehead against the cold glass, the way she had that first rainy night, except this time, the envelope in her bag didn't smell like anything at all, and her wrist still carried the ghost warmth of his hand, and she understood, with the same cold clarity she'd used to name 7 traitors at his table, exactly how deep she'd let herself walk into water she had sworn, 6 weeks earlier, she would never wade into again. Marisol was awake when she got home, sitting at the kitchen table with the new inhaler, testing the mist against her wrist, the way she always did, out of habit, before she'd trust it against her lungs. "You smell different," Marisol said, not looking up. "I smell like bleach. I smell like I always smell." "No," her sister said, with the particular unbothered accuracy that only a 12-year-old can manage before the world teaches her to be diplomatic. "You smell like cedar." Delia didn't answer that. She hung up her coat and checked the coffee can behind the cereal, out of habit, even though she knew exactly how much was in it now, and said, because it was the truest and least complicated thing she had in her, "I need to be at the laundromat in 90 minutes. Eat something before school. There's eggs." It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth, and Delia understood, standing in her own kitchen with the smell of cedar still clinging faintly to her wrist, that she had just stepped fully into a life with 2 sets of books of her own now, the honest one and the one she wasn't ready to say out loud, and that the line between those 2 ledgers had gotten thinner every single week since a Thursday night when a man told her to vanish and she decided, instead, to be seen. Delia Reyes never did get evicted. She never did stay away from that table either. Not for good, not for longer than she could stand it. Whether that makes her smart, or makes her exactly the kind of trap she warned Renzo she wasn't willing to be, that's not something this story is going to answer for you tonight. Salvatore Renzo built an empire out of never being surprised by anyone, and one overlooked woman with a rag and a bucket took that certainty apart in 18 minutes flat, in front of every man who'd ever underestimated her. What happens when the man who owns every stoop in the city starts waiting on hers instead? You tell me. Drop your prediction in the comments. Does Delia get out clean, or does that cedar smell follow her all the way down? If you want to find out what happens at the next long table, like this video, share it with somebody who loves a slow-burn crime story as much as you do, and subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss the next chapter.